What are the 4 tasks of mourning?
The first one is to accept the reality of the loss. The second one is to experience the pain and emotions of that grief. The third one is to adjust the environment within which the deceased is missing. And the fourth one is to withdraw emotionally and to invest that energy in other activities or relationships.
Hello and welcome back to the Soberful podcast. I'm Veronica.
And I am Chip.
And this is part 2. Part 1 was the cycle of grief, which was last week's episode. Today we're going to be talking about the 4 tasks of mourning. And the reason I wanted to do this, Chip, the reason I wanted to do it together is you've done several different lectures and I just thought, oh my God, that was so interesting. I've learned so much about different things from your lectures. And I thought we should really do that on the podcast, go deeper into it. So we talked about the cycle of grief that we go through when we lose something. And then the next part of the process is the tasks of mourning. What are the 4 tasks of mourning?
Okay, the first one is to accept the reality of the loss. I'll lay them all out now, and then first one is to accept the pain, to accept the reality of the loss. The second one is to experience the pain and emotions of that grief. The third one is to adjust the environment within which the deceased is missing, and that is one that will need explanation. And the fourth one is to withdraw emotionally and to invest that energy in other activities or relationships. So this is about moving on, really. And as we talked about in the previous podcast, this isn't just about the loss or death of a person. This can also be about the loss of a home or a job or a pet. You know, it can be this. In the last podcast, we talked about so many different processes. We talked about, process of change, process of relationships, process of grief, and things like that. And what we identified in that episode was that if you know where you are in a process, it makes life much easier. It makes the whole thing much easier to handle. It's when you're kind of floundering around, you don't know, well, why am I feeling this way? Why am I feeling a little bit, I'm not feeling as passionate about this woman as I used to, or this man as I used to 3 months ago? Well, because this always happens in relationships. And if you understand that, it makes it easier. So I think there is a similar process that happens after we have lost something. Now, that might be a person that we have lost. It could be a job or it could be a home. But the first process is we've got to accept that it's lost. Now, one of the things that I always encourage people who lose a loved one is, if possible, to actually see that person dead. And it's a difficult thing to say, and it's a difficult thing, but
not always possible,
no. But it absolutely helps with this, accepting the reality of the loss. When you have actually seen somebody dead in front of you, you cannot avoid accepting that person has lost. If you haven't had that process, and I've seen it happen in families where, for various reasons, some people were abroad or something like that, only a couple of members of the family were able to actually see the person dead. Other people who were a distance away weren't able to. And it's when they're not able to actually have seen the person dead that it's easier to get into denial that they haven't died, because you haven't seen them. So I think in the last podcast we talked about different cultures dealing with things. There's a big sort of culture in other cultures where the presence of the body is very obvious. It's very open, very obvious, and I think it helps to make people accept the reality of the loss. Because if you don't accept the reality of the loss, you're not going to be able to move on. There are various ways in which people do not accept the reality of the loss. They might, for instance, again, going back to the last podcast, we talked about Queen Victoria put out clothes for her husband for the next 40 years after his death. That was not accepting the reality of the loss. Some people keep bedrooms exactly the same, and that is something I will come back to a bit later on. But if we're looking at it from other points of view, we've heard stories about people who've been sacked from their job, and yet they've pretended to go into work every day because they cannot accept the reality. And, there may be reasons why they are frightened of telling the person that they're living with or accepting, but they'll pretend to go into work every day. I mean, that's quite an extreme example. But I think I was talking, about quite sort of mundane things, about perhaps losing a wedding ring or something, and searching and searching and searching and searching for days in the same place over and over again and not finding it, and yet going back to that same place over and over again in case it sort of magically appears. And that's just not accepting that it's gone.
I've done something like that.
Have you?
I tore up my house. I lost an inexpensive piece of jewelry, and you just say, there must be a corner or something. Until you accept it, you drive yourself crazy.
Yes. Yeah. It can be over all sorts of things. It can be a loss of a skill, a loss of I'm not as mobile as I used to be. I used to be very mobile. When I was young and youthful many, many decades ago, I was incredibly fit. I was, quite good at sports and,
Were you?
Yeah,
I don't see you as a sporty type. Were you?
Don't you? I was in the first 11 at cricket, and I used to play. Yeah, I was. Well, I mean, I went to a good public school, so you did sports every day. I was really good at hockey. I used to play hockey every week with my local team, and I was quite good at. I could do gym. I could do a crucifix on the rings, and which is, if you don't know what a crucifix is, you don't know gymnastics, but it's a difficult exercise. It's funny you should say that. You don't see me as that way.
Yeah.
I remember myself as that way. I remember myself as somebody who could do good things in gymnasium, who could, play a good game of rugby, who could play a really good game of cricket, but I can't do them any longer. So there's and I think, I've seen sportsmen go on too long because they're just not accepting that they can no longer do it. People who just, there are certain people who know when to retire and they retire at the right time. And there are others who go and they their career sort of ends in ignominy because they just go on too long because they cannot accept that they've lost that skill. So it's really important at the beginning of this process to accept the loss, whether it's the loss of a person, the loss of a skill, the loss of a job. You've just got to really work hard at accepting it. If anybody who listened to the last podcast would have heard us talk about denial and about how we can try and sort of kid ourselves that certain things haven't happened, but they have. And that's why you're not going to be able to move through this process unless you get that first one. Unless you accept that something's lost, you're not going to be able to move through this process.
And then the next stage, which is the bit that everyone's scared of, that we all want to run away from, is actually experiencing the pain of it.
Yeah.
The feelings.
We
without an anesthetic.
Yes, exactly. And which is where alcohol plays such, I think even I held on to that for quite a long time, actually. I thought, well, maybe if my son got killed, that would be a good enough excuse to not that I was looking for an excuse, but that would be a justifiable relapse. It would be such a dishonorable thing to do to his memory, to because he's proud of my recovery. So to dishonor him in that way would be awful.
And I have seen sadly many parents lose their children and stay sober, and it's an incredible thing.
Yeah.
Because nobody has a reason to drink if they can do that.
No, that was always my backdoor thing, and that'll be the one thing. And then as you said, I've seen people who have gone through it and have not drunk, and so well, that's that one gone. So we don't want to feel sad. Nobody wants to feel sad. People don't even want to, sometimes in this country, people don't even want to be seen to be sad. they'll say things like, oh, not too bad under the circumstances, comes and goes in waves, rather than say, no, I'm absolutely bloody distraught, actually. I'm really, really, and I admire people who can handle it very well, but I think at some point you have to experience it. Now, some people are able to do that in, say, certain circumstances during and while the loss is occurring, but getting really upset, crying, because you are going to have an absolute tsunami of emotions if it's an individual. Get upset. Don't be frightened of getting upset. I mean, what did my mother say at my father's funeral? There'll be no tears today. It's like, well, there were. I cried, and other people did as well. I mean, what a ridiculous thing to say at a funeral.
It's ridiculous. It's all culture. It's cultural. It's all cultures deal with this, the tasks of mourning and the process of mourning. Some cultures have some really well established tasks and processes that are very traditional and actually very helpful that people go through.
Yeah.
And I feel like we don't. I mean, we have funerals, that's about it.
I think we're absolutely awful at expressing emotion in this country, and getting upset and crying, and other cultures, as we talked about in the last podcast, are able to really let go and really get upset, and there's no sort of cultural shame. They just go, they get really, really upset and they let it out. And I'm sure it's a much healthier way of dealing with things rather than repressing it. I know I always use this example about sort of people who've been through wartime experiences and, don't even accept that something really bad has happened and they won't get upset until much later on. And that, well, he never talks about it. Well, how did he feel about the fact that his partner died? Well, he never talks about it. And the terrible thing about that is that all the lovely stuff about that particular person gets forgotten. Certainly in our household and sort of typical households like mine, the rule is you don't talk about that person any longer. So because it's going to make you upset, it's going to make you sad. But by avoiding that, you also avoid the ability to remember how lovely they were and the funny things they did and all the great times you did, because you've kind of set this rule in place. We're not going to experience this pain. We're not going to have this grief. And so you deny yourself the ability to remember, oh, do you remember when they did that? And it was so fun to really be able to laugh about some great things about the other person, because you're frightened that if you mention their name, you'll get upset. And so let's almost pretend that they didn't exist. But I think as I said, I think the awful thing about that is that people who had really wonderful characteristics get forgotten. And there's, I go to a regular self-help group on a Thursday night, and one of our members died recently. Well, no, actually it was a year ago the other day, but it didn't feel that long. But we were laughing, not at him, but, at the things he did and the things he had done together with other members of the group and how he was. And he was remembered so fondly because none of us were afraid to face how sad it made us, because as we were doing it, it did make us feel sad. But in the process, we were able to also remember all the lovely things about that person. So it is really important to go through those feelings, get them out, don't hold them back. And I do think I have a completely unscientific but I do think that if you hold in that kind of black sadness, that it's unhealthy for you.
Yeah, I think it can make you ill, physically ill.
I do think that. I mean, as I say, I've got no proof of it at all, but I do think that people who hold on to incredible sadness and will not let it out do make themselves ill. And so I think the second part of this process of experiencing the pain of the grief, I would really encourage people to try and do that as often as they need to, and if it means, I mean, I always refer back to this relationship that I lost. I did not accept that she'd gone for probably about 10 months. I kept on thinking she was going to walk back into my life. But the one thing I did do, I did get really, really upset. I was cried everywhere I went. I couldn't go to work. I was running a halfway house at the time. I couldn't go to work for weeks. I think I took about 3 weeks off work because I just couldn't stop crying. I subsequently learned that there were other issues at hand, at play about abandonment and things like that. But I can remember waking up on about the third morning and this great sob came out of me. And I'd never cried before like that. And I thought, oh my God, what's happening? But I cried and I cried and I cried. And after a few weeks, even I thought, this feels a little bit over the top for this particular situation. And obviously what I realized was that situation had triggered off a lot of stuff about other things that had happened in my life, other abandonments that had happened in my life that had not been dealt with and I'd never got upset about.
Yeah, I think that we can be quite terrified of our feelings. I mean, that was me. I was terrified of that. And the truth is, the reality of just it letting go, that's what it is. It's release. It's release of just releasing in a very, very physical way. There comes tremendous relief from it. And it's such an important part of the process. This is what we're talking here about, how we are all in these processes and that how we must be, we're always in and out of different processes and we can't miss, if we try and skip a part of the process, like I don't want to do that bit, we miss something so important and necessary to our own growth, understanding. The thing is, we all, whether we like it or not, we have to move forward, whether we like it or not. And that's growth. That's the pillar of growth. Growth is moving. We all have to move. And people don't. People get stuck. And that's just painful. But we all, and I think that the feeling of the feelings, that whether it, however you experience that, I know that I would rather have gouged my eyes out with a spoon, would really do anything to avoid it. But once I finally surrendered and released, at the end of that, I always felt better for it and grateful. Like there was something, the word that comes is necessary. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just necessary.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And I think some people, as I said in the previous podcast, people's grief process is their grief process. It's not for anybody to dictate it to anybody. You do it the way you want to do it, and it's up to you, how you do it. I do think there are, I know that, if I was to lose somebody in my family very close to me, I'm sure moving on would mean slightly letting go of them. And obviously I want to try and cling on to as much memory of them as possible. And if I go, well, okay, I've experienced the pain, I'm thinking about moving on now, it's trying to get the balance between, I'm not forgetting you, you're going to be in my mind every day. I look at my picture of my friend and I look at him. Sometimes I say, "Morning, Rob," and but it's trying to make sure that it's balanced and appropriate. That there's, which is really, I suppose, which segues neatly into the third thing, which is to adjust your environment within which the deceased is missing. So somebody is missing from your life, or something is missing from your life. Yeah. So you have to rearrange the environment. And, that thing about keeping bedrooms exactly as they were is at some point or other, you need to, yes, of course, you don't do it the next day, but at some point or other, there's an appropriate time when you have to go, okay, well, it's been a couple of years, I could actually make that room into an office or something, rather than keep it as a shrine, or you can do what you like. I think some point along you have to adjust your life, how you lead your life, what dictates your life. You have to do it in a way that acknowledges that person is no longer there. So that might mean having. I think photographs are quite a good example. How I'm sure I would. I'm absolutely sure I would do the same if Seth died. I would have photographs of him everywhere. But I think there would come a time when that became, I don't know. But I think I'd probably want to try and wouldn't want to get rid of them completely. And it's about the sort of the task is to adjust the environment,
Yes,
not completely
not erase,
adjust the environment.
Pretend it didn't happen. Is adjust to the new reality, isn't it?
Yes. So, if for the first year you had, I don't know, I mean, people used to wear black for a year after somebody had died, or maybe they've got a photograph which has got sort of black lace over it or something. There comes a time when that just has to be adjusted, and maybe photograph is still there, but it's not kind of sort of the first thing that hits you when you walk in the house. That there's a little bit of it might be moving furniture around. Well, that was his chair. I mean, I know that my neighbour, bless his heart, he's a lovely, lovely man, and there's a chair in his house that is where his wife used to sit, and nobody ever really sits in that chair. He did actually the other day. He got different chairs, and that was him readjusting his environment to the fact that this woman was no longer there. I'll tell you what else. He's a good example of what I mean here. She was a bit of a hoarder and a bit of a shopper, and she lived upstairs, he lived downstairs quite a lot. And he started, once he'd got over and he'd felt the grief, and he feels it, I'm sure, still quite a lot. He went upstairs and he realized there was a lot of stuff in this house that he didn't want to have anything to do with. Lots and lots of, crinoline night dresses or something, or, sauce. He found all kinds of things.
It's just
stuff. It's just stuff. Some of it was still in its boxes and everything. And Heidi and he went through it all together, and they got rid of it all, and they sold some of it, and they sent some to the charity shop. And that was him adjusting his environment to the fact that this woman was no longer there. It took him a while. It took him must be about 3 or 4 years since he died, yeah. But, he'd kept it a certain way, but then he got to the point where he had to kind of adjust things. So he got rid of all this stuff that was a memory of her, but it was just getting in the way. It was getting in the way of his house. And he, as I said, he sold quite a lot of it, and he was able to, he had a little smile on his face. He said, oh, wow, I can't remember what he got. He bought something quite nice with all the money that he'd got from selling these things. And there was a sort of pleasure there. But there comes a point when you just have to there's an appropriate way in which you leave things. And you may want to leave things as they were before as the person died. But then there comes a time when you just have to get rid of the clothes. And I think in some ways that's the one that people find most difficult.
And then, that's a very, losing someone. It's also adjusting your environment is one of the things I suggest to all my clients with alcohol is get rid of alcohol, get rid of glasses, get rid of the paraphernalia. It's really interesting, Chip. We're looking to buy a house, and a lot of the houses near us are new or fairly new. And in America, houses are different and bigger, but they all have bars, all of them. They all have like a mini bar area with a little sink and a wine fridge and a sort of. They all have a little area for that, and I just find that because sometimes I look at a house and I think, what would I do with that area? It is an area to entertain, and we do entertain. So it's quite handy to have the extra fridge to put soft drinks in or whatever. But it's like adjusting your environment as a part of mourning that you are no longer a person who drinks alcohol. That is definitely part of it, is making these adjustments and, getting rid of stuff that, and it is, I think stuff is a big part of it, isn't it? It's like the sports stuff or the stuff around the job. I've done that as well. Like I've kept things from jobs and then years later I'm like, why did I keep this? You just sort of I think a lot of that is about stuff, isn't it? And it's adjusting to the new reality by making some physical changes to the stuff and what you and your maybe your daily routine and things like that. Adjust accordingly to the new reality is kind of the gist of it, isn't it?
And also it can be something like adjusting the way in which you talk about that person, how the kind of verbal environment has changed, where one is able to move into a phase of, and for some people they're able to do it and embrace it quite quickly, but move into a phase where they're able to really remember the person in a funny way, can make jokes about them. It's not really appropriate, the day after to go and make a joke about them, because it's not appropriate. But later on, maybe after a year or so, the conversational environment changes, where as it moving from one of great sadness to moving one of really enjoying those person's jokes or those person's activities or those person's things that they used to do, and to be able to laugh about it and to really embrace laughter. And that's a shift, an emotional and sort of verbal shift of the environment. When my friend Rob died, I would remember his birthday, his clean time birthday. I would, remember very now sometimes the date will go by and I go, oh God, yeah, that was the day Rob died. My memory environment would have changed slightly as well, because it has to shift. You can't, otherwise you're just stuck, and you're not moving forward.
The last one, which really just, this makes so much sense. So the last task of mourning is
to withdraw emotion, energy, and reinvest in other relationships. So
yes,
this is not to be interpreted as, okay, right, they've gone, next person, please. It's about making sure that you obviously retain the memory that you want to attend, but that it doesn't consume you and prevent you from getting interested in other things, other people. You may have lost somebody at an age where it's perfectly appropriate later on to get involved with somebody else. It might be with the loss of alcohol. Okay, well, what are you going to do instead of drinking? You're going to invest all that emotional energy, and you're going to reinvest it in other relationships, other hobbies, other activities, other things like that. And I think it's really important that you eventually allow yourself to kind of move on and get interested in other things and other people. It might be other people, it might be other things, but particularly in relation to alcoholism, it took up a lot of our time. Suddenly it's gone. We've gone through all the distress and the worry about what am I going to do? How am I going to live my life without alcohol? All that sort of stuff. And that's going to be painful and difficult. And we've tried to get rid of alcohol out of our house and things like that. And we've readjusted our environment. But then we've got time on our hands. So what am I going to do with that time? How am I going to spend that time? And, you talk a lot about, quite rightly, about connecting with other people, connecting with sober people, connecting with people who aren't drinking, connecting and using that energy in a just reinvesting that energy in a different way.
It's one of the reasons that people start charities.
Yes.
When someone passes, I actually read something recently in England that there's too many people are all starting a charity when someone passes, and there's like thousands of these like little pots of that they need to be consolidated a little bit, but you can understand it because it's a way of putting that. It's exactly what you're saying. You feel like I'm at least doing something good. It's busy. There's a lot. Totally makes sense.
It makes sense. But I think yes, I think there is a line when there are. Yeah, that's a whole different discussion. But I do think in terms of drinking, it's really important because what's the one thing that people fear? What am I going to do with my life when this alcohol is taken away, when this thing is deceased, this thing is no longer active in my life and it's gone? What am I going to do? People get frightened. That's the pain and the feelings they have about it. They get frightened and they don't know how to readjust their environment. They don't know how to mingle. They don't know how to socialize. They don't know how to do those things. So it's really important to try to do that. And then to get involved in connecting with other sober people, other sober activities, things that, bring pleasure and joy. And hopefully.
That's why, like, when we both got, clean and sober, AA is still a really big, it's still part of my life. But at the beginning, it was a really big part of my life. And it was my life because I didn't have a life. And I just did a lot in AA because I didn't really have it. And then your life starts happening and that balances out and what have you, right? But it's super helpful. It's one of the tasks.
Yeah. I mean, my big feelings when my drugs were taken away was I'm completely lost. I'm anxious. I'm scared. I'm shy. Those were the emotions that I went through when I lost my. And then, as you said, I kind of started to go to different places where they weren't drugs around, and I went to meetings, and I went to NA meetings, and I invested a lot of, and I've got a whole new life as a result of that, and from connecting with different people, and we see it in Soberful about people making connections with people, and it helps to make people feel less lonely, because if you don't want to just give up alcohol and then have nothing to replace it, because that's obviously going to be very difficult. But I think for me, it's about working hard on accepting the reality of the loss, making sure that you really accept that. Have the feelings. Don't be frightened of saying, this really pisses me off. This makes me really sad. This makes me bereft. Whatever the feelings are, express them. Experience them. Don't stuff them down.
Yeah.
Then start to think about eventually shifting your life and your world. It might be your house. It might be something, the hobbies that you do, in recognition of the fact that something or somebody is missing. And then eventually being able to move on with the kind of acceptance that we were talking about in the last podcast, using that acceptance to move on and maybe get involved with somebody else or get involved with some other activity or whatever it is that's going to bring you happiness.
And so I hope you find these 2 episodes useful. I know that they can be quite deep and quite heavy, but it's really important to know about these processes. They can help us tremendously in whatever it is we are grieving, what loss we're experiencing, to know that where you are in the stage, where you are in the process, what happens next, and getting some support and help with that and expressing your feelings, everything that Chip said. So we'd love to know how this helped you and what you think.
Yeah.
And that was, I find that really, really interesting. I think that was really, it really helped me the first time I heard you explain it. I was like, and then, and it's how we continue and grow and all of that kind of stuff. Right. All right. We will be back next week. Thanks so much. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast and we will see you soon. Take care.
Thanks.